Thank you, Dima. Really appreciate the organizers for this workshop to give us this opportunity to present this paper. Yeah, so let me just jump right into it because the time is limited. We have a bunch of co-authors here on this paper. One is Yuhan Cheng, who is now at Shandong University, Yanchu Liu at Lingnan College in Zhongshan University, and Tang at Tsinghua. All right, let me jump right into it. So I'm going to try to give you a bit of motivation for what we're trying to do here, right? I will use this quote, not from a mainstream economist or a machine learning scientist, but rather from the editor-in-chief at Wired. And mind you, this quote was all the way back in 2008. So this was before things have gotten, 10 times, 100 times more crazy. But the quote started with something that I hope everybody's familiar with, which is saying that from this quote from George Box, who said that all models are wrong, but some are useful. And the sentiment kind of expressed there is that we know that we're working with imperfect models, right? But in a way, we don't have anything better to go with. So kind of this is kind of what we live with. And we just have to try to make the best of the situation in some way. But what Chris Anderson was talking about in this quote here is that he's pointing to these kind of large tech companies, Google, which are kind of grown up in the area of this massively abundant data, so kind of big data era. And they are basically just learning directly from data in a way that similarly has nothing to do with these kind of quote unquote theoretical models we hold dear to ourselves, especially if those of you in the audience who are kind of a theorist here. So we kind of felt left alone and in a way kind of sad because we're worried that we're becoming obsolete in some sense. I think this sentiment is not just in the tech world, it's very much kind of ongoing, right, in the finance economics field as well. And that's kind of the starting point of this paper. So I want to change a little bit and think about now why we think potentially there is a room for combining theory with the data. I want to use this somewhat kind of cheeky example of hypothetically imagine what we want to train or build a robot to play pool, right? So what would you do if you are a data scientist? Well, if you're a data scientist, you would try to collect a bunch of data, maybe using this kind of a video image capture, the data about how the shots are being made, in particular, what's the angle you're hitting the ball, in what position, with what force, right? Those are the inputs. And then you kind of record the outputs, such as the direction the ball is traveling, at what speed, and what spin, and so on, where it ends up. So you can basically formulate this into a supervised learning problem with this set of inputs and then predicting these set of outputs, right? If you have a lot of data, and this is a big if, then you can potentially learn about the relationship between the two, because this, after all, is a pretty kind of a stable system. But we know that labeling this kind of data is very expensive. Right? It's not an easy thing to do. So that brings us to the second idea, which is that we can actually go back to our physics class in high school. There we actually learned a very beautiful but very kind of a parsimonious theory, which is this theory of perfect elastic collisions. Right? So there we learned that if you have imposed this conservation law of linear momentum and the kinetic energy, you basically have two equations with two unknowns being the velocity, direction at which the balls will be traveling after the collision. And you can solve the system very easily. It's something that a high school student can do. It generates very precise predictions, actually, about the outcome of the collision after everything has gone through motion. So that seems to suggest that we can just directly teach the robot that, right? We don't have to actually collect the data. We don't have to go through all this expensive stuff. Now, what is the problem with this? Now, we know that this model is likely misspecified. So maybe if you train a robot using this theoretical model alone, you probably do okay. Maybe you can beat an average pool player, but maybe you're not going to reach like this superhuman level of competence, right? So if you want to go at the next level, you need to actually take into account these imperfections, such as, the collision actually is not perfectly elastic. You're not playing on a perfectly smooth surface and things like that, right? That actually is where the data could really help. So in a way, refining or fine-tuning the model to kind of speak to the imperfections of the world. And I think that's exactly where we're going to try to propose this approach of how to combine theory from data. In particular, when we recognize the fact that theories are imperfect, right? Going back to George Box's quote, that all models are wrong. So while we acknowledge the fact that theories are imperfect, can we actually still use it to somehow guide our learning from the data? And what we're proposing is this so-called transfer learning framework. Those of you who are not familiar with this, don't worry, I'll go into the details of how exactly this structure works. But sure, put in simple terms, it's basically saying that we're going to learn from theory by effectively learning from the synthetic data generated by the theory. That will be the first step. You're going to learn something about the theory, in particular, inheriting the structural restrictions that are imposed by the theory. And then in the second stage, we now bring in the real data and learn from real data. But when we learn from the real data in the second stage, you're not going to start from scratch. You can actually take these model that you learn from the synthetic data that inherits these structural restrictions as the starting point. Right? So in a way, you're getting a warm start in some sense. We're going to show that this approach, in our experience, because we can't really have very rigorous theoretical arguments behind this, but in our kind of applications, we show that this really works well in terms of bringing in the structural restriction from the economic models, as well as taking this point that they're imperfect models, so that we don't necessarily treat them as hard constraints. And effectively, and in the end result is that we're going to be able to get, hopefully, the best of both worlds. Okay. All right. So let me quickly overview the results in case I run out of time. So I will first, of course, explain the structure of the transfer learning framework. But in terms of the empirical results, I can preview here. The first is that the transfer learning model that we built really significantly outperforms a conventional deep learning model that does not have the kind of the help from the structure model. We also compare this transfer learning model to a arguably mainstream structural model, which is this Heston model of stochastic volatility, and we show that the transfer learning model really comfortably beat both models. And interestingly, when we look at the gap between the transfer learning model and the conventional deep learning model, we see that the gap actually widened, meaning that the transfer learning model gains an even more significant advantage when the following are true. Right? So one is that when its training size, sample size of the training data is small, they're, of course, building a heavily parameterized model using a relatively small sample size. We all know that's going to be challenging. But that turns out to be not such a problem for transfer learning. Again, thanks to the fact that you are preconditioning the starting point of the parameters to be where the structural model would dictate. The second thing is that when market conditions are volatile, that's also where you see the gap in performance for the transfer learning enlarges. And then finally, if you construct some kind of a metric between where this new data point you're trying to make a prediction with is from the distribution of the training data, right? So basically imagine some kind of distance measure between this new data point and the training data point. If that distance widens, which basically tells us that this is a kind of uncommon observation, that is again where the comparative advantage of the transfer learning model seems to really become more significant. That to us signals that the generalizability of these transfer learning model is better than this traditional deep learning model, which as you move out or near, right, the boundary of the training data, obviously, the ability to kind of infer or extrapolate is going to become questionable. I'm going to talk about a couple other things that are in particular related to our understanding of the transfer learning framework as well. In particular, there is this literature that is kind of new in economics, but that has been going on for a while in the physics world in particular, that tries to impose economic restrictions or physics laws into the machine learning models, right? They will be imposed as essentially hard constraints and treated very seriously. And there's a good reason behind that. If you are, for example, a physicist and imposing dynamics of by well-accepted physics laws into the model, right? That clearly should help regulate the system. But what we want to point out is that actually in our case, because of the imperfections, going again back to the George Box quote, because of the imperfections in the structural models, we would argue that treating them not as hard constraint actually would be better. In fact, that's naturally going to be happening in the transfer learning framework because the structural restrictions are going to be only taken seriously in the source domain in the first stage. And in the second stage, its influence will be either high or low depending on the hyperparameters we can choose. Okay. And then finally, there is a very related literature about the informative priors imposed on our Bayesian methods, where the informative priors can be actually derived from structural models. So I'm going to talk about this relatively old literature of the Bayesian VARs, where people have really tried hard to incorporate these kind of informative priors from, for example, DSG models. We see that actually there's a lot of similarity between the two approaches in the sense that, loosely speaking, you can think about the structural restriction in our transfer learning framework also playing the roles of informative prior, but there are going to be important differences as well, right? We're going to try to show you about that. Finally, as a little bit kind of a self-serving advertisement, I would try to hopefully convince you that this is really a very flexible, but also really easy to use framework. You see that relative to your usual workflow of training a neural network, you just need to add one more step of training on the synthetic data. So in any situation where there is a relatively reasonable candidate structural model that generates the synthetic data for you, you could actually try our method. Okay, so let me quickly kind of talk about the related literature here in the interest of time. Be happy to discuss more. Obviously, there's a massive kind of explosion of interest in bringing machine learning into economics and finance. To us, though, I think the literature that's particularly interesting are the papers that try to take some form of economic restrictions seriously. It goes back to, for example, the first paper here, Garcia and Genke. Sorry for butchering the name here, pronunciation here. This is the paper that basically tries to take advantage of the kind of a homogeneity property of the model, meaning that for example, stock price and the strike price should be somehow scalable with each other, right? Using these kind of simple, intuitive restrictions imposed on the model, and they show that can help. Campbell and Thompson doesn't have too much to do with our familiar machine learning models, but in that return predictability literature, right, imposing restrictions on the signs of coefficient is yet another way to bring economic restriction. There are more recent examples too. For example, the Chen, Pagler, and Zhu paper that basically imposes no arbitrary restriction into the machine learning model that tries to learn the STF. Campello, Tang, and Zhou is another recent paper that tries to use, again, theory to try to make corporate finance applications out of it, right? I will talk a little bit more about the physics-informed neural network and the Bayesian VAR a little bit later. It's going to show up in our kind of understanding of the transfer learning field. So let me actually, in the interest of time, move on. And again, feel free to interrupt me and if you have any questions, okay? I will first talk about essentially the first step, which is what do we mean by learning from theory, right? We're going to first learn from theory and learn from data. So what do we mean by learning from theory? This actually comes from a previous paper I've worked on with a different set of co-authors, Anton Didishem and Simon Scheidegger. But basically, the idea is the following. It's quite simple, and it has its own purpose of application for people in this audience as well. So imagine that our structural model is this complicated machinery that maps states and parameters into some output, right? So cranking up this machinery is complicated and costly. So it would be nice if you can basically build a lookup table, the same lookup table that is going to take the same inputs and hopefully very accurately produce the same output. What's the purpose of building this lookup table? Well, this lookup table, in particular, network parameters of the lookup table, are effectively going to inherit the structural restrictions that our model has, right? This structural model is going to have. So in a way, training this neural network that accurately captures the mapping between the inputs and output, effectively is going to be our way of quote unquote teaching the machine learning model about the structural restrictions. That's, of course, only the starting point. But let me talk a little bit more about how the starting point could actually be materialized, right? So imagine the structural model is just a set of economic restrictions. So in particular, let's imagine we can write a restriction in the way of a moment restriction or simply an equation. So in this case, imagine that the y hat is some expected value of y that we're trying to model, and that depends on some observable state variables S and hidden state variables H, and maybe there's some structural parameters theta in our model too. So there's going to be a mapping between the model predictions and the actual outcomes. We can allow for some measurement errors in there, but once you average it out, this should be the model prediction. So effectively, when we say we want to build a lookup table or teach the neural network to learn about the restrictions embedded in this model, is basically exactly that. Try to generate a neural network to replace the role of this F function, right? And in particular, in this paper that I cited over here, Chen, Didishan, and Scheidegger, we also are interested in structural estimation. That's why we also folded the parameters, the structural parameters, as a part of the so-called pseudo states. So we can build a even larger dimensional mapping between the inputs and output. And once you have that, you can imagine that once we build that model, right, then solving for things like option prices using the inputs and parameters becomes almost instant, because evaluating this network, right, this neural network, is way faster than solving some PDEs or some affine models if you're living in that kind of a space. But yeah, so the short answer is basically that we can take some loss function that is measuring the model prediction with the actual values, y hat here, and try to minimize the distance between the two, right? So this is we're trying to be a little bit vague here in terms of what the loss function can use. But minimizing this empirical loss is just a typical way we'll train the network. What's different though is that we're not going to be using any real data at all in this process. All the data are being generated from the structure model. In particular, right, we can start with some hierarchical prior on the theta, the structural parameters, and then from that draw the data about the states, hidden states, and then from that solve or put them into the structure model, solve it in a traditional way, hopefully efficient way, traditional way, generate a training sample of mapping between the states, parameters, and output by y hat, and we're going to generate a lot of them. This step is tedious, costly. We don't have anything smart to say about it, but hopefully there is an efficient way to generate a lot of this training sample. Once we do, though, we can then train a neural network on it so that we can recover a high-dimensional lookup table. And that's where the savings come in, right? So that once the training is done, we can now basically throw away all the code that you have for solving those PDEs and finally just take advantage of this neural network mapping very quickly and hopefully very accurately. So that's what that paper did. And I just want to kind of show you why it would be actually natural to use deep neural network for this purpose. Right? Because this has to do with the fact that these neural networks are very expressive. It has to do with this theoretical results of the universal approximation theorem. Basically, for any reasonably smooth functions, right? If you are able to choose the architecture, in particular with deep neural networks, you will be able to actually approximate these smooth functions to an arbitrary level of accuracy. That's this well-known universal approximation theorem. But even more remarkably, there are going to be type of problems you can actually exploit the structure of the problem such that you can overcome or partially overcome this cursive dimensionality. I kind of mentioned very briefly and relaxingly, about generating a large amount of training data. Right? So remember, you have to generate a large of mapping between the states and the y hat from solving this model again and again. That really is the most costly bottleneck of building this surrogate here. But that, in some cases, right, could actually be done in a more efficient way. In particular, for the types of problems that we're working with in the option pricing literature, it is a fantastic class of models that has been shown theoretically that the training sample size does not grow exponentially in the dimension of the input. This actually is a hugely valuable insight. Effectively, this just means that when you generate training sample to build this mapping between inputs and output, you don't need to go crazy. You still need a large sample size, but certainly as the model becomes more complicated, as long as you're living in this class of Black-Scholes PDEs, you can actually get by with a potentially much smaller training sample size, and that will save a lot of time. But anyway, that's not the key point of what I'm trying to try today. I just want to show you very quickly a flavor of the savings in terms of computing time, right? For those of you who are interested in doing structural estimation with your option pricing model, this is a model that we use from taking off the shelf from the literature. It's a double exponential jump diffusion model with stochastic volatility. Some people refer to this as the base model. So this model, by the way, if you count all the state variables, the hidden state, and the parameters, the input dimension is 13, right? So this is a pretty high dimensional model already. You're basically trying to build a 13-dimensional lookup table, effectively. We're going to try to run a very quick kind of a quick and dirty back of the envelope calculation to show you the magnitude of the saving in computing time. So you could try to price 1 day worth of an option, if you're using the S&P 500 option, is on the order of, let's say, 4,000 a day. You can do that using the fast Fourier transform. So because this model actually is in the affine class, you can do that using Fourier transforms. That doesn't seem to cost that much time. It's about 10 seconds. But imagine you need to do this estimation, which basically means that you have to do a parameter search, solving this model again and again many times. The time starts to scale up. So you're now looking at hundreds of seconds. If you have to do this daily re-estimation for 1 year worth of data, right? Now then it linearly multiplies in terms of the computing time. So now you're talking about hundreds of hours. On the other hand, if we pay the upfront cost of building this surrogate, deep surrogate neural network, you can actually price these same options with much less time, and in particular with estimation way faster. Okay, and then finally, if you use the deep surrogate and the GPU, because the neural networks are very friendly with this parallelization, using GPU can really make the problem even more efficient. So in that paper, we actually show how we were able to take this model to data and estimate these parameters. And in fact, there's interesting economic information in the parameters as well. I've already spoken too much about this paper, but it does provide a nice kind of a starting point to think about the transfer learning. So for those of you who are interested, I would recommend you check out this link. On this GitHub page here, we actually put the trained network for 2 models. One is the Haskell model, the other one is this space model in there. You'd be happy to, you might be interested in checking out, especially if you teach like option pricing class to students, it might be fun for them to play with, okay? All right, apologize for that, but now we can think about how we can integrate this learning from theory with data. So the idea basically is that now we can actually take the restrictions from the theoretical restrictions from the model and combine them with the data, hopefully in an efficient way, right? Before I talk about exactly how we do this, conceptually, you can see why that might help. For one, there is potentially this regularization effect, right? When you impose restrictions on the heavily parameterized model, if nothing else, it kind of reduces the variance. Now, you might do so at the cost of introducing more bias, and that's why there's this bias variance trade-off there. But it certainly is possible that this variance reduction might help, especially in situations that might think natural. For example, when the sample size is small, when you have to travel to the boundaries of the kind of a training data space so that the extrapolation becomes questionable and so on. The second benefit is that it will really become a lot faster to train because you're not starting from scratch with some randomly initialized parameters for the neural network, but rather with hopefully a good starting point. So convergence becomes faster on real data. And in principle, you could actually get away with training a deep neural network with substantially smaller data size, right? Something that we would not be thinking is possible without these help of the economic model and the synthetic data. And the third thing, as I mentioned, is that we actually believe that the transfer learning approach can actually help improve the generalizability beyond the training data boundary. So I'm going to show you some evidence of that, hopefully. Okay. All right. By the way, there are 2 related approaches here that's worth mentioning. One is just, like I said before, imposing these equilibrium restrictions directly when estimating the models. Right? So we have a long tradition of doing this in rational expectation econometrics. It's the modern day version of that, in the physics field is what I mentioned is the physics informed neural networks. Basically, train the neural network on the observable data, but impose the physics laws as if they are actually hard constraints. A related literature is this Bayesian VAR, right? So there we derive informative priors from the economic model, such as the DSG model when you're interested in making macro forecasts. The early version of this simply imposed random walk restrictions to try to regulate the VAR. But there are more sophisticated versions. In particular, the Del Negro and Shorefly paper, 2004, is a version where they, practically speaking, generate synthetic data from a DSG model, estimate the VAR on that set of data, and then use that as the informative prior to try to update using real data again. Okay? That is, of course, fundamentally a Bayesian framework. I'm going to try to talk about the difference between that and the transfer learning here. Superficially, the difference is going to be that the VAR framework, of course, is fundamentally linear, whereas the carried over to the transform learning part, you can actually use much more complicated dynamics in here. So that's potentially promising. But there's actually something more fundamentally different as well, which is that in the end, the transfer learning is actually not a Bayesian framework. Okay. All right. So let me actually talk about the idea behind the transfer learning framework. So this is actually something that we are familiar with, by the way. Those of you who are using ChatGPT in your daily workflow have been using essentially transfer learning, right? So we have these large language models that are essentially what's called foundation models, trained on a lot of data, trying to generalize like general kind of distribution of properties of the human language. They have been kind of fine-tuned in many different settings. Right? For example, one example is the sentiment analysis. Right? If you start from scratch to build a language, a model to do sentiment analysis using, for example, STM, it's going to be okay, but certainly not kind of the state of the art in terms of performance. You'll be much easier and the better performance yielding if you start with, for example, like a GPT-2 or 3, and then fine tune it for the purpose of sentiment analysis. Right? That has been shown to be effective. Another example is in computer vision. So people have been, using these pre-trained, again, quote unquote, foundation models trained on this ImageNet, a lot of pictures in the data set, and then fine tune it for medical image analysis, right? Trying to read like CT scans, for example. So in our case, analogy is really, really clear. So basically, in our case, what we want to do is use the economic model to serve as the source domain. We want to build, quote unquote, a foundation model using this economic model. And then we want to fine tune it for the purpose of predicting the actual data. We recognize the fact that the two may not be actually following the same distribution. But the fundamental data generating process of the true data might be different from what the theoretical model predicts. That's why using this kind of a fine tuning would allow us to potentially move away from the distribution implied by the structural model and hopefully get closer to the true data generating process. Right? So that's kind of the basic idea behind this. Now, how do we actually make this happen? So first thing, again, so first just train in the source domain using synthetic data. Right? You need to be able to generate synthetic data from the theoretical model. Let's think about that as your favorite option pricing model. Inputs, output mapping in this way. And then we try to build a mapping, just like you saw earlier in that deep survey paper. Right? We try to generate a mapping between the input and output using a neural network. We can actually be flexible about what kind of objective or loss function you want to use. You could simply minimize some kind of measure of pricing errors. If you care about capturing other restrictions, such as restrictions about delta, vega, all these Greeks, you can impose them as additional objectives as well. So you do this as a multi-target learning. This is pretty flexible. And then when it comes to the target domain, this is where you want to bring in real data, right? But when you bring in real data, we're not going to forget about the weights about the network we learned from the source domain. In fact, we're going to use these weights as the starting point. That's kind of the main thing. And then we're going to try to do what's called fine tuning, which basically means that when we update the parameters, we're going to use a much smaller learning rate. This, again, we don't have a rigorous proof for why this always does better. Maybe it doesn't. But in empirical applications, we have found that this slow learning rate really is important. We also need to decide how many epochs that we need to choose. In other words, when you kind of run the model through this copy of real data, how many times you run through it, right? The epoch determines. That also turns out to be pretty important parameter, hyperparameter, determining in the end how far away you're going to be traveling away from the initial starting point. There are a couple important technical details here as well, which is that if you think about the theoretical model, how it maps into the data, there potentially could be discrepancies about what relevant inputs you would use in the source domain versus using in the target domain, right? Let me give you an example of this. So if you build a option pricing model using, let's say, the Heston model, right? The Heston model is completely silent about how things like option market liquidity, bid-ask spreads, would affect option prices. So naturally, when you generate simulated data, that simulated data would tell us nothing. In fact, it's completely silent, right, about how the bid-ask spreads would potentially affect prices. But in reality, we very much would like to entertain the idea that additional features could matter. So in other words, the input in the real data space could potentially be larger, or in some dimensions larger. In other dimensions, it might be smaller. For example, some hidden states that are important, like say hidden volatility that is important for the theoretical model, may not be directly observable. Right? So there are potentially mismatch in both directions. What we can potentially do is one of the two approaches. One is what's called conditioning down. So in other words, for the features that are in the structural model, but it's not directly observable, you could potentially think about, sorry, I messed up. So think about features that are in the data, but that actually not in the theoretical model. You can imagine basically averaging them out, right? You can just generate these fictitious features in your theoretical model. Of course, the theoretical model will not use them, so that the machine learning model trained on the synthetic data would realize these are irrelevant features effectively. And then in the second stage, they will still be kept as inputs. At that point, the training on the target domain can actually help let these additional features speak, right? And then potentially affect the results. So that's one direction. The other thing is about the features that might be in our structural model. So like, for example, hidden volatility state is an important input, obviously, for option prices, but we don't directly observe them. What do? We can do filtering. And actually, a nice thing about this is that because we have a structural model ready to go, filtering out of the structural model using this deep surrogate is really, really fast. It goes back to the point I mentioned earlier about structural estimation using these neural network representation has this side benefit of allowing us to filtering out the hidden states. Okay, but once we have that, then the training here is pretty straightforward. So you can see in this case, we just need to build another loss function. In this case, because we don't necessarily directly observe the delta and gammas and the vegas anymore, we just use the pricing errors as the target domain loss function, right, to determine the target domain loss function. And this will finally give us the weights over here that's given by W tilde. And notice that the W tilde are going to be different from the initial weights W hat, which are the ones inherited from the source domain. Okay. There are some additional technical details you can get into if you're interested. But in the interest of time, I'm going to kind of skip through them. So for example, when people apply this transfer learning methodology, they actually have additional flexibility in controlling, either to replace or update the entire network, like I'm describing over here. So all the parameters can be, or weights can be updated, or you can choose to voluntarily freeze some of the layers of the network. The idea is that maybe let's say the bottom half of the neural network are capturing something about the theoretical, more fundamental relationships, and you freeze them, don't let them update, and only update the upper half of the weights, right? So there are kind of more kind of esoteric approaches over here. We have actually in the paper discussed the experimental results and how they're different. If there are no additional questions, I'm going to jump into the application, right? So I'm going to try to talk about an application that is hopefully interesting to this audience in particular, which is a option pricing application. So we're interested in pricing options using three different approaches. One is this transfer learning approach, right? So I'm going to pick, in particular, perhaps surprising to some of you, is I'm going to pick a very weak structural model, which is this Black-Scholes model, as our source domain model. So you know that this model is going to be pretty severely misspecified. It doesn't fit the data well, but the question is, can you actually add value to our learning? The second candidate model we're going to compare the transfer learning to is a conventional, quote unquote, deep neural network. The difference between the transfer learning model and the deep neural network is only in terms of the initial parameter, right? How you initialize the parameters. In the deep neural network, the architecture is exactly the same. but the parameter is going to be initialized randomly, whereas the transfer learning, as I explained before, they're going to be taking these initial parameters from the structure model. We're going to add a bunch of additional features to it too, such as these pass returns, bit express, put call ratios, and so on. So that's why the total dimension of the inputs is quite a bit larger. There's some additional information about the architecture of the neural network we're using. We're using a relatively deep neural network, 18 layers, 17 hidden layers. Relatively narrow, so each hidden layer has 22 neurons in it. We're using this so-called ResNet, or residual network, which is a way to basically allow us to train the deeper network structure easier by controlling this vanishing gradient problem. And then the last part is this activation function using the leaky ReLU. Okay, so here's the experiment, right? So we take these standard data on S&P 500 index options from option metrics. At the end of every quarter, we're going to treat the previous 9 months as our training sample. Okay? We're basically not trying to maximize the predicted accuracy. We're trying to mimic a performance where the amount of training data is kind of artificially capped at 9 months worth of daily option prices. There's a large cross-section. So the data size, depending on which part of the sample you look at, could be pretty large, could be pretty small in the early parts in particular. And then we're going to try to make the learned model using any one of these approach and make it predict option price in the next 3 months, right? And I'm going to report the mean absolute pricing errors in the next 3 months as our quote-unquote out of sample. We can also use a Heston model, which is our structural model candidate to compare. Because in the early part of the literature, taking machine learning to option pricing, people actually have concluded that it's not so easy to beat these structural models. But we're going to show you that the conclusion perhaps changes when you use a more flexible structure, especially when the data is available. So here is the first picture showing you the comparison between the 3 models as a horse race. The red solid line is the out of sample, is 3 months ahead, mean absolute errors across all the options in that 3 months. And we're going to do this on a quarter by quarter basis, right? So the gray dotted line is or gray dashed line, I guess, is this conventional deep neural network. Mind you, exactly the same architecture, okay? Trained effectively on the same size of real data. But the difference, of course, is that the red line has the guide from the structural model to tune. And then the gray line does not. And then finally, we have the Heston model. Oh, yes, please.
Yeah, question from Lars. So like, I don't get it. So like for the transfer learning model, so why doesn't the prior wash out eventually? So the prior is the Black-Scholes model, but like if we have infinite data, then the prior is irrelevant eventually.
Eventually, yes. So that's why the fine tuning is important. And you can actually artificially cap how far away you travel away from the initial data, right? If you don't kind of cap the learning rate and the number of epochs, you're right. With enough kind of laundering through this real data, you will eventually forget about the structural model entirely.
Okay, so then how do you choose a hyperparameter?
The hyperparameter, yeah. So I can't say we have a very deep understanding behind it. Our experiment is that when you choose substantially lower, these learning rates compared to the learning rate we use in the source domain is about 2 orders of magnitude smaller. That's in terms of fine tuning we're discussing. And then we actually have statistics about the number of epochs we use. With that, this is the outcome we see.
But then the red line is a function of the learning rate. So you have multiple red lines essentially. So absolutely, yes. So we are showing you one. We're showing you one learning rate here. Did you show me the best one?
I don't know if it's the best one. Yeah, we haven't done exclusive. I mean, it's very difficult, right, to kind of tune these hyperparameters, as anyone who has played with these models before. So we basically tried a bunch to try to see the robustness of this. In this neighborhood, what we're observing is that it's relatively stable. But I certainly cannot claim this is somehow the global optimum or not.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, that's definitely shocking because the Black-Scholes model is such a poor model. Because initially I thought like you won't use the Black-Scholes model because in physics the models are pretty good. I mean,
exactly. Yes.
physics model are excellent fits of the data compared to a finance model, and like Schwartz model, they're pretty weak models, right?
Yes.
You can easily reject these models, and physics model, they're super hard to reject. And even though basically you're saying you're using like a poor fit, like a weakly fit model, which you can easily reject, even that prior is pretty good compared to the noise in the data, which dominates the deep neural network without a prior, basically.
Yeah, so I actually agree with everything you said, but I would just frame it a little bit differently. I think what you're saying is basically suggesting that depending on the degree of misspecification in the structural model we're using, the learning rate and the number of epochs should be different, which I totally agree with. Right? So basically, if you know that the model is providing a lot of legitimate information, you should not artificially reduce its weight. In a way, if you think about imposing these constraints as hard constraints, is like putting a lot of weight on this constraint, right? So the large range multiplier on this constraint is very high. Whereas here, we don't explicitly choose the weights. It's kind of the tuning parameters that are playing the role of choosing the weights. But yes, if you know that the model is weak to begin with, you don't necessarily want to put a lot of weight on it, which is, I think, exactly what you're describing. So I totally agree.
And then did you try the Bates model as a prior?
We have not. Yes. This is something that we could potentially do as well. We deliberately picked this model in a way because we're kind of curious, right? Imposing something as basic as a Black-Scholes restriction, does it help or not? And this turns out, actually, in our experiment, it really does help quite a bit. I should actually mention, by the way, that the blue dotted line is the Hesston model out of sample performance, right? As you can see that early part of the sample, the Hesston model doesn't really lose relative to the neural network. I think in part that has to do with the fact that the training sample size is small. Over time, the amount of options traded just really exploded. So in later part of sample, with a sufficiently deep network, you can actually substantially outperform. But of course, it doesn't explain why the out-of-sample performance deteriorated for the Hesston model. Maybe that has to do with the fact that these short-dated options are becoming more popular, and that, of course, the structural model has a hard time fitting, and the neural network has the flexibility to do that. But anyway, so it can tell different stories of why that's the case, but what's kind of striking is that consistently the transfer learning framework does seem to outperform both of them. Okay, all right, so we actually did a bit of simple performance attribution analysis to see what explains the gap between these two models, right? So we can construct these relative sort of gap in the pricing errors between the two models, the transfer learning model and the traditional deep learning model on a daily basis. And we're gonna, option by option, and we're gonna try to run panel regression to see what are the variables can explain this gap. And here is a quick summary, because the table is pretty large. First of all, we find that when markets are more volatile, as measured by implied volatility or these left tail probability, in a paper by Boleslav and Todorov and Shi, we find that when markets are more volatile, these are times the gap tends to be large. In other words, the coefficient on these two variables are positive. We also construct a distance measure. This is the Mahalanobis distance between the inputs that we're using to make the forecast, and calculate the distance of that from the empirical distribution of the training sample. So roughly speaking, the Mahalanobis distance is effectively approximating the empirical distribution using multivariate normal. You need to calculate the means and the variance covariance matrix of all these variables in the training sample. And then you calculate the distance measure, which is quite intuitive, right? Kind of like the like t-statistic in some sense. So whenever this distance is large, you can argue that's when this input for this new prediction you're trying to make looks somehow more uncommon or unusual compared to the empirical data you train. And we found that that turns out to be a significant predictor for the performance gap. So that to us is a sign that the transfer learning problem is helping with alleviating the generalizability issue with the deep neural network, right? Because when you travel to the boundaries of the training data, or maybe even go out of it, that's where try to use the relationship you learn from the training data and try to extrapolate becomes really problematic. So not surprisingly, deep neural networks, traditional deep neural networks, is going to be suffering in those regions, but it seems like the transfer learning is helping, which is kind of good to see. You can kind of see that actually in this here, right? So some of the spikes are actually kind of to be expected. For example, the great financial crisis where the gap really widened, and similarly in the early stage of the COVID pandemic, you see also the gap widening, right? That's exactly corresponding to, or confirming, I should say, or consistent, let me be more tempered in our language, consistent with this notion that when things look different, right, having some theoretical guidance is helpful. There are other things that I can see, for example, in the cross-section, options with a lower beta spreads tend to have higher gaps, interestingly. Maybe, so again, I'm speculating here, but because the theoretical models are not very good at handling options that are very illiquid, perhaps imposing those restrictions is not necessarily going to be very helpful with those options either. Having more flexibility perhaps is better. Also, interestingly, for options with short and long maturity, that seems to be cases where the performance of the transfer learning model is better. For long-dated option, my intuition is that the sample size naturally will be small, right? So the trading sample size of the long-dated option is small. And secondly, those like, for example, like short-dated jumps or liquidity, those issues are just mattering less in terms of the pricing. And the structural model actually has an easier time capturing the fundamental relationship. Perhaps that's why adding that gives you more bang for the buck. For short-dated option, I can't make the argument that they just naturally fit better. They don't, but the structural models. But there we do have quite a significantly larger sample size. So maybe that's also helping with the performance of the transfer learning. Okay, let me keep going. So we now going to show you a bunch of, I don't have, let me use maybe 5 minutes and try to wrap up. So I'm going to try to show you a few diagnostics we do to try to get to some understanding of why the transfer learning is outperforming. I'm going to be a bit brief on this, so I apologize. So the first thing naturally you might be interested in asking is that, is theory simply helping us identify what are the relevant state variables, right? Obviously, this Black-Scholes model tells us there are stock price, strike price, time to maturity, interest rate, volatility. This is what matters, nothing else matters. So that naturally very effectively narrowed down the list of variables we should be considering. Maybe that's what's helping. Well, here is our investigation of this. We basically do train a deep neural network using only the Black-Scholes inputs, right? So in other words, we are giving us, in a way, kind of the benefit of looking at one of the main insights of the Black-Scholes model and using these inputs. It turns out that actually helps somewhat. It lowers the mean absolute errors by somewhat in most of the regions, but not at the same order of magnitude of improvement in the transfer learning model. And exactly the opposite actually happened with the transfer learning model. In fact, you can see here, if you artificially cap the inputs of the transfer learning model to the Black-Scholes inputs, that in some cases actually hurts the performance, and hurts the performance by quite a bit. Speaking to the fact that this second stage actually is quite important, right? To be able to adapt what you learn from the theory to the data. When the data looks very different from theory, that step is actually quite important. Okay. The second question you might be interested in asking is it because we have more data? Because effectively you can view this transfer learning as basically training the neural network on two sources of data, right? One is the real data, the other one is synthetic data. So maybe you'd be wondering, okay, if I give the deep neural network more data, either by abandoning that previous rolling window approach, every time only given 9 months, let's just use expanding window. Why are we wasting some data? Would that be able to effectively get competitive performance? Or let's pool the synthetic data with the real data. Would that be able to get the performance we want? It turns out the answer to both is no. There are a lot of lines here. The red line is still the same. Every time you see a red line in these type of picture is always the same. So that's our benchmark transfer learning performance. The kind of a grayish dashed line is our old deep learning model. And then we try two things. One is do the expanding window approach. That is this darker colored dotted line. This just basically means that every time when you train the deep neural network, you don't just use the previous 9 months, use all the data from the beginning. And the later on, of course, can get more and more data, right? But that doesn't really seem to move the needle at all. So we can pretty much quickly just ignore the fact this expanding window approach does not work. It doesn't. What does work, however, is this so-called warm starting approach. What is the warm starting approach? Is that every time you update your neural network, again, without the help of the structural model, But every time you update neural network, you use the neural network parameters you have learned from the previous episode. Okay, so I move a 3 month ahead for the next quarter. I use what the parameters I learned from this quarter as the starting point. That actually effectively helps, right? So you might be wondering why that's the case, because accumulating these knowledge by using the parameter is like having more data. But I think the fundamental difference here is that the weights given to the recent data and the past data are actually different. When you're doing warm start, it is like saying that the weights given to the more recent data are higher effectively, especially when you run through this most recent 9 months with a lot of epochs and so on, right? That initial weights are going to be kind of downplayed, just like Lars' question earlier about why structural model eventually can be forgotten. Here is the same thing. So that turns out to actually help, right? At the same time of keeping the memory of the old knowledge from the previous data, as well as using the real data, the most recent real data in an effective way, seems to close the gap somewhat. Doesn't cover completely, but closes the gap somewhat. All right, and then here is just simply pulling the synthetic data with the real data. You might be thinking, okay, let's just generate a bunch of fake data and then put it together with the real data and train together. And that doesn't seem to work, right? So I think this perhaps speaks to the fact that you want to actually separate learning from the theoretical model from the learning on the real data, because in the second stage, what we really care about is learning the true data generating process for the real data, not some kind of mixture of the two. Putting the two data together is like averaging out two models, which might actually be very different. Right? This would not hurt you so much if the theoretical model is very close to the true DGP, but in a lot of economic applications, that is not the case.
So let me interrupt you with a question from Catherine Shalin. The question
yes, please.
is, what happens if we combine the transfer learning approach with other theoretical models, for example, Heston or Bates?
Yeah, so I actually don't have the answer ready for that. It's kind of similar to what Lars asked earlier, but why didn't we use the base model as a way to? We chose this kind of on purpose to illustrate the fact that even you can a simple model like the Black-Scholes can help. But you're right that there is going to be a scale, right? So as you go to a more sophisticated model, if we know that those models are indeed addressing some of the misspecification issues, in principle, I think they should help. We should expect the performance to rise. But if you're imposing restrictions that are clearly violated in the data, going to those more complicated models, it would potentially hurt more. So in the end, there is a bias variance trade-off that is guiding this in overall performance. All right, I have a couple other things to say here, but I'm going to be short on time.
You need to think about finishing up, yeah.
Exactly. So I'm keeping my clock here. So two things, and I'll wrap up, I promise. So one is, what if you just impose this restriction from the structural model directly, right? Kind of like these physics-informed networks. Let's impose the restrictions, and you can easily impose these constraints, do a constraint optimization in the neural network, or we can do this as a multi-target, basically introduce like a two-sided loss function, one speaking to the fitting errors, the other one speaking to the violation of the structural restrictions. And that's what we did over here. And you find out that based on our limited experiment, I should say, we find out that these kind of multi-target learning doesn't really do the trick either. Again, I think I will go back to more of my argument earlier, which is that averaging out the constraints is not effectively go when we know that potentially these constraints are misspecified. We want them to help us regulate the learning from data, but we don't necessarily want their bias to affect our learning from real data too much. Okay. One final thing is, what if you impose something going the other direction of the question that was being asked a couple of times, go to something even simpler, right? Because we know that these models are misspecified. You could actually go for something that's a really weak restriction, like the no arbitrage restrictions. So you can, in fact, generate synthetic data that satisfy only the no arbitrage restriction, which we believe that are pretty much close to be true. And then you can just do the transfer learning again, right? This time, even the Black-Scholes restriction not imposed. And you can see that if you do that, the transfer learning with the no arbitrage restriction are given by this black dotted line. And the performance is not as good most of the time, except for maybe the last blip over here. That, in a way, is suggesting that the restrictions cannot be too weak. These restrictions we're imposing from the theory, if they're so weak that they're actually kind of obvious from the data, that adding them or not adding them is not going to help so much of the learning from the directly from the data. But maybe something is going on here, though. So this kind of simple no arbitrage restriction seems like it's helping in the during the pandemic years. All right, I promise this is going to be the last slide, and I'll wrap up. Which is, how is this different from just Bayesian framework, right? So if you think about the sample size of synthetic data versus the sample size of real data as this relative sample size, our intuition is to be that if it's a Bayesian framework, the sample size of synthetic data basically controls how strong the prior we're imposing. If you have a large synthetic sample size, the prior is really strong. That means moving away from the prior should be difficult. And the opposite should be true if you have a small relative sample set, right? In fact, that's exactly what Dao, Nigro, and Shorthai show in their paper. There is this inverse U-shaped relationship between forecasting accuracy and lambda. It's kind of interesting. Basically, it says that if you use too much or too little weight on this DSG model, neither of them is going to give you good performance. Right? Again, speaking to the fact that we want to learn from DSG model, but we don't want to trust them too much. We actually did exactly this experiment in our setting with transfer learning. And you see that we don't get this U-shaped relation. We actually choose 4 different points in time to illustrate this idea of changing the lambda. You find out that the lambda, generally, these relative pricing errors first rise for the higher lambda, and then most of them just flattens out. Right? So obviously, it's very difficult actually computationally to generate these confidence bands. So there's still quite a bit of uncertainty, but by and large, they don't seem to show any tendency of going back down as the lambda goes become pretty large. What's the reason behind that? Well, it's because when we train the neural network on the synthetic data, even if you give me like unlimited data, I just learn about the structural restriction very accurately. That's it. In the end, it's still only a starting point when I learn from the real data, right? When the target domain starts. So that's why there is not such a kind of a automatic relationship that when you train the model on a lot of synthetic data, you will somehow impose restrictions stronger. It does because the restrictions are learned more accurately, but beyond a certain point, there is not going to be much bang for the buck anymore. All right, so let me just conclude. Okay, so I hope this is somewhat intriguing for those of you who are interested in combining theoretical insights with the learning from the data. We think this is a very flexible framework that, like I said, any situation we can find a candidate model can generate synthetic data. You could actually give a try to this. We already have some kind of applications that we're trying on this front as well. One last thing I want to say perhaps is that perhaps this framework can also help us feed back to our theoretical modeling framework. So think about those features that are outside of the theoretical model, but we are using in our second stage in the target domain. If you find out that those features turn out to be actually significant, I think that is a strong indication that those features should be treated seriously and somehow incorporated into our theory. So perhaps just by playing with this performance gap between the source domain and target domain, we can actually effectively recover what are the features that are left out, but perhaps left out by mistake. Anyway, so let me stop here and by concluding saying, maybe theory is not all that, right? For those of you who are, in fact, consider yourself a theorist, let's not despair. And maybe there is actually a new life here, embracing, the stage of combining theory and data and get the best of both worlds.
So thanks very much. So at this point, we'd like to invite anyone who has any question to feel free to unmute yourself and use your microphone. So please go ahead.
Hi, Hui, it's me again. I have a question
Yes.
about the warm start, because the warm start to me is just like, so when you read any textbook about kind of convex optimization, they always recommend a warm start because it leads the algorithm to faster convergence, right?
That's true. Yes.
So like, what was your argument about why the warm start does better? Because it seems like it's just a better converged model in a sense.
Yeah, so I think there are the two comments here. So one, the reason we didn't do warm start in our baseline case is because, again, we're not interested in recovering the best predictive model. We're trying to construct this kind of artificial experiment, right? Every time we have a limited amount of data and we're trying to make the forecast using either deep neural network or transfer learning. And in that case, there is no sense of a warm start because everything is essentially starting from scratch as we want it to be, right? The second part is that now in a realistic setting, if you actually care about generating better performance for deep neural network, I totally agree. Of course, you want to use warm start. It would be kind of silly to try to deliberately forget about the things you learned from the past. But this is where the warm start is different from the expanding window approach, right? So in particular, I want to draw your attention to the green line here versus the black dotted line here. The difference between these two approaches, as my interpretation goes, is that the the expanding window approach uses all the historical data, but it uses it in a kind of an equal weighted fashion. There's no sense that the data that happened in the recent past is somehow going to be weighted more. But if the underlying relationship is somehow time varying, right? If there's some kind of structural kind of instability there, then you don't want to do it that way. The parameters are changing over time, so putting more weights on the recent data is better. And that, in a way, is what warm start is automatically doing for us. I think that's why you're getting better performance potential.
So then the warm start should be closer to the rolling window, I guess, in that interpretation.
Yeah, right.
So just a quick clarification question. I probably should have asked it before, but all of these things are in sample at a given point in time?
What I'm showing you are all out of sample. So
Out
in
of
other
sample.
words, in the sense that we are using this rolling window approach,
Yeah.
let's imagine pick any point on this line, right? So we are training using data from the last 9 months, and we are making prediction for the next 3 months.
Okay.
And I'm showing you here the mean absolute error in that 3 months.
Okay. So philosophically, to go back to Lars's question, so what's going on here when you're showing us, you know, the warm start, for instance, is that the universal representation theorem is telling you that there is a solution, but actually there's probably an infinity of solution or local optimum that describe relatively similarly the data. And the warm start is starting from such a solution in the past, which helps you get something that is better. And what you're showing us is that transfer learning is not only starting from one such solution, but one such solution guided by theory. And this is much better, right?
Yeah, okay, this is a very good question. So I should be more clear about this, right? So in a way, you can think about the transfer learning as being somehow handicapped when you compare to the warm start for the following reason, right? In the transform learning model, we are basically always reinitialize the parameters using the parameters you learn in the source domain. So the starting point every quarter is the same. And then we just learn from these 3 months of data, 9 months of data, right? And then try to make a forecast. In that sense, it was not allowed to look back and look at all the historical data as what the warm start or rolling window approach is trying to do. Right?
Yes, but if you had infinite computing power, the DNN with expanding windows or rolling windows would eventually converge or could eventually converge to the TL solution. It's one of the admissible solutions of the DNN.
If there's enough data in the kind of this close vicinity of the point we're making predictions with, I would agree with that, right? Because you have to assume that somehow there's this kind of local stationarity in the relationship between the joint distribution between the X and the Y's. I think what we're discovering here is that the relationship is not stable over time, right? That's why using these warm stars somehow gives you an edge. The relationship changes from time to time, and you want to weight the most recent data more heavily. So in principle, I agree with you. If there is a unlimited amount of data and computing power, you can actually learn this kind of local relationship very accurately. Of course, I totally agree with that, right? But the whole point is that with limited data, sometimes we can't even afford to train a heavily parameterized model like this kind of deep learning model. Think about the DSGE VAR example, right? There we have quarterly data. Would you be able to train a neural network? Probably not. But with transfer learning, not obvious. In fact, we have some preliminary evidence suggesting you could do that even in that kind of setting. when the data is extremely scarce, real data.
Quick comment. I think what you said in the conclusion slide is very interesting about taking the full loop and trying to think how we improve models based on this. What is there a way to bake this up into the approach where it just basically points you to the gradient? This is the gradient. This is where we should be like thinking more about going this direction and adding that direction.
Yeah, no, so I don't have a good answer for that. I think I very much like that direction of providing a tool that kind of systematically diagnose where the wiki link is. Right now, I'm thinking like at a simpler level, right? Just basically identify features that are left out. But you're absolutely right that in a way, thinking about these model restrictions, in what directions that are most inconsistent with the real data, right? If we can somehow identify that systematically, that would certainly be the direction we should work on. That's another level more sophisticated than what I was proposing here, which is simply looking at these kind of left out features.
Is there anyone else who has questions?
Just a quick question, Hui. Thank you for the presentation.
Yeah.
Can you? I couldn't. I have to read the paper. Sorry if it's there. What is the size of synthetic data?
So it changes. So what we like, for example, this is where we show like depending on the sorry. So yeah, so you can see this picture, right? So in this case, the x-axis is the lambda, which is the size of the synthetic data over real data. So early part of the sample, we need to use a very high lambda. So on the order of say, let's say 60 or 50 times bigger than the training data size, or the real data size. I forgot the exact number, I apologize for that. But later on, for example, in the 2000s, 2020s, the real data actually becomes very sizable. There, you don't actually need a very large synthetic data size anymore to get a competitive performance. Yeah, so there's not one answer to that. Yeah. But one thing actually you can see from this picture is that if I extrapolate, it doesn't hurt. If you have unlimited computing power, just generate a lot of data. Right? It will not hurt you by training on this large amount of synthetic data, because the one thing that comes out of that is that you're going to be able to learn the structural relationships very, very accurately. But that still only serves as a starting point when you bring in the real data in the target domain. So I think that's the reason why that this blue line doesn't bend downward when the synthetic data size becomes large. I think that's a way perhaps to address some of the concern. How do I actually I optimal lambda? I would say if you can afford it, just choose a large lambda. Yeah,
Yeah, because I've chosen a smaller lambda back then, but the over parameterization, if you have complex model, I couldn't let you push it forward. So that's why I asked. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
I agree. Yes.
Well, on that note, thank you very much, Hui. It was a very interesting way of concluding this VDW season. Very enthusiastic about opening the black box and seeing if theory can guide the machines in their endeavor to